The reason I'm a socialist is in part because it provides a unifying reason to want to move in this direction.
But you see more people fundamentally undercutting and undermining important institutions that exist. How you have more people talking about how, like, fundamentally, like the very fabric, the very tools, that the very skeleton that we use in order to maneuver this political, ideological, social, cultural project that is our nation is fundamentally broken.
I mean, I think the next 20 to 30 years are going to be some of the most harrowing years for democracy since the 1930s, 1920s and 30s.
Mm-hmm. And under the very, like, relatively short period of time that I've been interested in politics, you know, being a very young person myself, you know, I've seen Trump, I've seen Boris Johnson, I've seen the rise of the Sweden Democrats over here. Yeah.
And the answer is that if you're a few at the top, it's easier for you to support public bads. Pollution is easier to support because let's say it's 10% of the population owns all the capital. If you're only 10% of the population, you only get 10% of the hurts of pollution, but you get 100% of the benefits. It is so frightening to me that Elon Musk could just, like, let's say he liquidated all of his Tesla shares tomorrow, only got like a dime on the dollar for them, 10%. He'd still have like $20 billion or something along those lines. He could fund Fox News for like 20 years.
Did you know what video of mine that Micah was referring to?
I don't know. He might have been referring to Econoboy, but he's in your YouTube chat.
Oh, Econoboy?
No. Irfan. He's in your YouTube chat.
Oh, he's asking who won. Oh, fuck. I have no idea. That it was a very.
I think the concern on the co-ops was about modeling what they try and maximize.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to get back into a second discussion,
okay.
Unless you're interested.
So, are you familiar with my document on worker cooperatives?
No.
Okay, I would be interested to actually see what you thought about that. I thought everyone was familiar with my work. Okay, no, but hold on, let me see if I can find this. So I made a research document on worker cooperatives probably like a year ago or something, almost a year ago. From now, where I had a bunch of like resources, and I recognized a lot of what you were saying from it, and I looked at the policy prescription. So it's a decently large document, 17 pages. Don't read all of it now, but if you go to the very bottom, and you look at this, the conclusion, values, limitations, and potential policy proposals, how do those look to you? I'm just curious.
Satisfaction.
So pages 15, 16, and 17.
So I guess the concern that Micah would oppose to like addition of tax incentives is if co-ops are potentially less productive, reducing their tax incentives could encourage an unproductive type of firm to get ahead. I'd be totally in favor of this because your list is tax incentives for cooperative firms, tax incentives for owners to turn their firm into cooperative, preferential loans or grants for cooperatives, educational and training programs, funding of research, which is absolutely, I mean, that's just true for everything, and government loans. I think the big thing, there's this book called, I cited it a few times through the debate today, and it's also very long. It's titled The Labor Managed Firm, Theoretical Foundations. And one of his chapter 19 and 20 are the policy conclusions. And I haven't fully read through it, but he argues that part of the reason that cooperatives ain't as popular as conventional firms comes down to a lot of financing concerns and free rider problems that the state can solve, that a government can solve by like forcing cooperatives into federations, by encouraging the formation of federations, stuff like that. Yeah, so I love these.
Okay. And when it comes to the limitations and so values, I think is not much there. But when it comes to limitations, I had the potential abuse of contract labor. And this is actually something, because this is one of the major arguments that I've often heard against worker cooperatives, is because worker cooperatives tend to have a more compressed wage structure, right? How the ratio between the top earner and the lowest earners tend to be a lot smaller than in conventional firms. So then if you're like a high skill labor, so you have, whether it be really good experience or really good education, so you're often occupying kind of the top echelons of these wage hierarchies then. assuming that one country were to transition towards more worker cooperatives and therefore see more compressed wage structures, wouldn't that create an incentive for that high skill labor to move and go work in another place where they still have conventional firms and still have those really sharp and distinct wage hierarchies, because they can reap the benefits from the very top of that?
Possibly. One of the things, so we have some empirical evidence on labor flight from taxes, income taxes, which is not exactly identical, but it is related. And as far as I'm aware, in the United States at least, there's no evidence that higher income taxes encourage people to move. There's no evidence that states with higher income taxes see higher out migration of high income people or higher in migration of low income people. And the theory for that is that labor isn't perfectly mobile. There's a lot of things which tie you down, like family, the firm, your connections. Like a lot of times high income people have have high income because they have connections. They are like lawyers or doctors, and so they have a practice, they have patients. They can't just flee and take it all with them. So that's less true for stuff like software workers, but software workers already do that. Any job that can be done remotely, some guy in India is trying to do it. So I think a lot of this comes down to physical versus like remote types of jobs.
Yeah, so where I got this is from Burden 15, page 10 on my document, titled Equality Under Threat by the Talented, Evidence from Worker-Managed Firms. And you can see my brief summary of this, how there's a small wage premium associated with being in a worker-managed firms. However, worker-managed firms suffer from brain drain, so the separation hazard, the risk of them leaving, of high-ability members is more than 3 times higher than that of low-ability members. And you can see that there's a relationship between the extent of pay compression and the severity of this brain drain in worker-managed firms. So there seems to be some empirical evidence for even this from the co-op context, which is why I think it merited...
I think this is a totally worthwhile concern, but it becomes less true the more that the whole world develops, and the more that, in the book, I think it's called Why Market Socialism. One of the ideas set out is that is of a slightly imaginary Sweden, of an actually existing. Take Sweden, take the Meidner plan, and go another step left, go another step left. Does that look like socialism? And they aren't entirely sure. There's a lot of discussion on that. But one of their arguments is that a slightly imaginary Sweden can't exist without a slightly imaginary Europe. It's not possible to have like all of the goals we want and a world in which those goals are antithetical to everyone else. I think this is a concern, but it's partially alleviated by trying to move the whole world in that direction.
Of course, and that's like an additional limitation to just paradigm shifts as a whole in general, because especially when it comes to ones that accomplish better, humanitarian benefits, sometimes at the expense of more like direct private compensation. So such is the case with these like high skill laborers, where you do need to be very careful, and it needs to be like a coordinated thing. Otherwise, you kind of get a bit of the same principle as the race of the bottom thing that you guys were discussing before, unless you do it like really, coordinated in like large swaths of the global international economy, and not just like one country or even more like local chapters engaging in this type of things, because it might be really punishing for them.
This problem only occurs if there are other large high-income countries that fit this profile. So like a key example might actually be right now the United States. Because it has such a high wage differential, people can move from Europe, where wages are more compressed, to the United States and get like a wage advantage. It's possible that's what's happening like right now.
We do see that happen to some, where like extraordinarily talented and highly qualified, whatever we're talking about, doctors or teachers or whatever, how they will oftentimes go to the US because they can earn like crazy amounts of money there. But
and I'm certain there's probably some, I would imagine Switzerland too might be in some of those situations because they're not in a lot of the EU stuff.
Probably.
But I don't know enough about Sweden. But I do think this is a concern, but I think this is how do I put this? This is a political concern, not an economic one. It's a feasibility concern of how do we get there, not a concern of like, is this desirable or not? Because if this study is correct, it actually suggests that like in a world where everything is more compressed, everything is more cooperative, cooperatives might actually be more productive because they can retain their top talent. So yeah, it's that.
I understand, but so I understand obviously what you're saying in that it's an argument for a complete cooperative transition, so to say. But
well,
then,
not necessarily complete. It's just that it gets easier the more other countries are doing it, right?
of course, but yeah, it becomes easier the more the countries do it, but it also becomes harder to do that for everybody as compared for just like one country, of course. So it's like a mixed thing. How you realize that, hey, this is how we accomplish like it becomes easier to reap the maximum benefits from worker cooperatives the more countries do it, but it also is a punishment. It's also like a penalty because it's harder to get more actors on board with something. A lot of the time. But yeah.
I mean, I totally agree, but I think that there is some role here for like inspiration, essentially. Like a lot of people in the US on housing policy have been really inspired by like Finland, which has a pretty aggressive housing first approach, which seems to have basically eliminated long-term homelessness in Finland. So, you know, props. And that inspires policy copycats around the world. I think that part of the goal is like, if you do these policies and they work out well, if we do the experiment and they work, then other people will adopt them. If we do the experiment and fail, then other people will move away from them. Like, I think that's a lot of the story of like the whole world after the 1990s. The collapse of the Soviet fucking Union was a really big blow to like the left, not just because they lost money or funding or direct support or whatever, but because like the big totem fucking got destroyed.
Yeah,
that's on.
Kind of, but I'm gonna add a bit of another type of nuance to this as well. I think that another major thing is that the risk for undercutting with stuff like this becomes significantly higher because countries aren't just in the same spot, you know, when it comes to economic things. And this is one of the major things. I'm a big fan of economic integration and stuff like that. But one of the things I always mention whenever people talk about the EU becoming more and more federalized is that we need to make sure that all of the countries are in a similar space economically and fiscally before we start setting like federal aggregate, like, hey, everyone, you need to do your economy this way, fiscal policy needs to be this way, because unless you have that kind of like a similar starting point, then a policy which might be best for the majority of the people or majority of the countries, I should say, is actually really destructive for like one or two countries, and then that fucking sucks for them, and that kind of brings about destabilization. How they relate to the co-op thing, I'm just gonna just tying it back, is that you might see like you might have a country that specifically they can benefit a fuck ton from specifically high skilled labor, and for them they prioritize that a lot more than the broader benefits you might get for worker cooperatives. So therefore they might be incentivized, because countries are in different positions fundamentally, to undercut the rest of the countries by not perhaps engaging in the same cooperative project, and therefore reaping some benefits when it comes to attraction of high skilled labor, for example.
Yeah, I think that is very much a real concern. And the solution in part has to look like increasing equalization of income. And like just due to the fact that poorer countries tend to grow faster, there seems to be some catch-up effect. I don't know, the cause for that is very debated. But like globally, there has been a convergence of incomes, is my understanding. That's also very debated, but I tend to side more with the convergence of income theory. And so over time, this problem should tend to get easier. Especially if our politics tends to move in the same direction. I guess I did want to say, like, there is a real risk of this. So, like, something that Irfan was talking about was capital flight. That is a very real thing. Income flight, it doesn't seem to have great evidence. But capital flight, there's a lot of evidence that when countries in Europe increased their wealth taxes, people just moved. Because the people with enough wealth...
Yeah, I'm sorry.
The people with enough wealth can just move that wealth, especially when it's like not physical wealth of some kind, but when it's financial wealth. And so that's a lot, like, I think a lot of it comes down to liquidity and mobility. So like, you know, it's funny you say all this. This, like, never mind. I don't want to get into that, but just like I do agree this is a concern. I think that one of the ways to reduce this concern is to try and push for like better worker rights in other countries to some degree.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I'm in favor of, like, irrespective of all this worker cooperative things, I am in favor of the general like equalization of just conditions international, because it just makes so many things, so many political struggles and such so much easier. But that's it's because of stuff like this, like potentially very destructive. So I'm gonna get, this is my personal political philosophy. This is why I don't call myself a market socialist.
Okay.
Is fundamentally is that when there are such real, potentially super duper destructive theoretical concerns that exist that we need to be very careful to avoid, and we need to consciously be aware of and be cognizant of. It feels strange for me to right now argue for a far away, like, theoretical future where we don't know exactly how well we'll be able to manage these very, very real and potentially very destructive theoretical concerns that we have. And that's why my advocacy is surrounded mostly in, like, hey, even though, you know, theoretically, these, like, I understand how all these ideas about worker co-ops, they have really good incentives. They probably would lead to really beneficial changes socially, politically, culturally, whatever we want to talk about. That's perfectly fine. But attaching myself fundamentally to a position that I don't know if empirically is going to work out just seems like a really unnecessary gamble.
Sure. So I understand this. A lot of, like, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union should have come as a massive wake-up call that we can't just experiment leftward and not have any blowback. The blowback has been 40 years, right? 30 years of moves rightward. So experiments have costs. They hurt people, and they can hurt, like, the movement or whatever. Even like if someone does a socialist experiment and it fails, it will blow back on SOCDEMs too, as it has. So I totally understand that. I guess that's why my advocacy is focused a lot on experimental approaches and reformist approaches, that, like, we should try doing something in, like, a sector. We should try doing something randomly. We should try to do something in a way that's studyable, in part because it can provide better theoretical understanding of the issues, in part because it limits the risk, and in part because it provides, like, an organizing idea for others to get around, right? Housing First wasn't developed in a day in Finland. It was a movement. And they tried it in a few cities, and they expanded it and expanded it. In Canada, for example, single-payer healthcare was adopted in one province, and then it became adopted all over. I think that's, like, the approach the left needs to look to is a lot of experimenting and trying things that we do know work, and then going a step beyond them, but trying to minimize our risk as much as possible. So I know I did give a big long spiel there too, but if I want to give one additional, more, like, esoteric sort of argument, there's this quote from Irving Howe, who is the co-founder of the Democratic Socialist of America, that socialism is the name of our desire, that there is utopia and then there is utopia. There is, like, something which you can impose on people, but then there's utopia which swells up from the movement of people. There's a utopia which provides people, like, the moral sustenance to keep going. The reason I'm a socialist is in part because it provides a unifying reason to want to move in this direction. Like, having that name, having that, like, understanding of, like, the long workers' marches for democracy, I think that moral goal is really important. It's harder, it's easier to organize people, I think, when you have a story to tell them. And socialism is part of that story. It's the dream, it's the utopia, and it's never really here, but we can move towards it. We can keep trying. That's why, I guess.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. And so, and here we're going to run into a bit my huge distaste for populism that might be coloring my perception a bit. So I'm just going to ask, like, one simple question first. We both acknowledge that that research, especially empirical and, like, practical research and implementation of worker cooperatives is in its very early stages. Like, it's in, like, pretty much its infancy, in a lot of regards, right? We would both agree on that, right?
Maybe, like, toddlerhood.
Toddler. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, you know what? I'll accept the toddler for this debate. I'll grant you the toddler. Okay.
Toddler accepted.
Okay. Great. Excellent. So, given that that's the case, we might. I think that there is a non-negligible possibility that, you know, when we do this experimentation, either one of the theoretical issues that we have already identified ends up being a really, really big and significant issue, a lot more than we thought it would be, or a brand new theoretical concern that we weren't even able to conceptualize before it, like, got put into practice, kind of pops up, and we're like, oh fuck, this seems very difficult, if not, like, impossible, or maybe even, given the current, like, material conditions or whatever, not worth it to advocate for and push for. And therefore, because of the possibility for stuff like that popping up, that's why I'm hesitant to attach myself to that label of that end goal before I know if there's, like, that we can securely get there without some big thing coming up that's going to completely throw me off it. And this kind of brings us back to the thing you were talking about, telling the story. Yeah, absolutely. Telling the story, and a lot of the things that, you know, populists do, which have a lot to do with telling a story and stuff like that, it is absolutely, you know, helpful for mobilizing people. However, the issue there is that once you've told a story, you've kind of married people to a specific process more than you have with necessarily like the outcomes that that process is meant to have in the first place. So that assuming that we have a movement that is centered around telling people a story about socialism or whatever, and now we suddenly get to the point where I talked about where we do more research and realize that, holy fuck, you know, there's these big issues that we aren't sure how to resolve for right now. We might be in a situation where, because people weren't taught to look at this on the basis of its ability to accomplish these ends, and we just look at it as a goal in itself, that people might try to push through and go through with that regardless, and therefore we end up in a pretty bad situation.
So I think that's reasonable. I think the reason, so the difficulty is just political change is hard, and without that story, you won't be getting in that direction at all. There won't be the experiments to have at all. And I do understand, like something Mike and I were talking about is that a lot of times, like the mass membership of movements is very different than like the academia that sort of stands behind it or whatever. The academia of like libertarianism is like all these people arguing about like open borders and like, you know, getting rid of as many regulations as possible. But the actual like, you know, people in the mass movement of libertarianism are like super racist and really dumb. I pulled up the clip of like all the libertarians booing at the idea of a driver's license.
Yeah, exactly. I remember that one. What's so, next? Like, a license to toast bread in your own toaster?
It's so good. It's so. I mean,
you know, I would like to see some standards in care. Boo! Yeah, it's a banger clip.
The reason that I bring that up is because like, unfortunately, every movement that gets political power is going to be tempered by needing to get mass appeal to some degree. Not unfortunately. I mean, I think that like democracy tends to yield so many better outcomes that it's worth it. It's just that like this is like inevitable to any movement. Like social democracy is tempered by a lot of like dumb stuff around, like a lot of early of social democracy before like 2018 or something in the United States was really NIMBY. It was really, really pro rent control and really didn't like developers and so on. And like AOC might be changing that in the United States, but who knows? I think that it's just a bargain you have to make. Democracy is like a big bargain. You're never going to get exactly what you want. And so you need the story. You need like really compelling narratives that maybe go like that provide a unifying theme to all the evidence you have, all the morals you have, and that push people far enough to actually get those changes to experiment with in the first place. Because if you don't get that, how can you prove that you should go further?
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of
yeah. But the problem is that I think that rallying people behind, like, hey, you know, these are the political values that we really want. And I think my mic I'm probably a lot more quieter on my stream.
I can hear you. You're just fine.
You can hear me fine, but I think I'm trying to figure out some OBS stuff. But I think my mic is a lot quieter now. But we'll see. I'll figure it out later. How I'm perfectly fine with people like rallying around like certain principles and certain values. Like if we want to talk about, you know, like equality, I think that's a fine value to you know, come around. If we're talking about the virtues of democracy and stuff like that, I think that's excellent to go rally behind that. But when we start introducing specific processes and specific things with policy implications, like for example you do have with socialism, that's when I feel it goes beyond a bit of just like the, hey, we're doing this because of its value, to now we're going so far into this to the point where, yeah, I mean, probably arguing for like a specific thing, like a set of like, of course, very broad and very vague policies, like socialism, for example, is going to be more efficient than just values. But then by attaching yourself to a process as well, you kind of go beyond just like, hey, this is the outcome, this is the end goal, and now you're attaching yourself to a degree of like a process as well. And that's why I think that if you attach yourself to values, you can still perfectly get to like, yeah, justifications for the like experimentation. And I understand that, because fundamentally, like, even though you and I have very different ideas when it comes to the way that we probably do like political philosophy, at least in the way that we identify politically and how we like present ourselves when it comes to our ideals and stuff like that, I think, and as we just discovered, right, when it comes to worker cooperatives, which is like a major political project, we still align perfectly on what we're meant to do from now. And it stems back, and this is something I said even back when I was a market socialist, is that we don't want the world to be a better place because we're market socialist. We are market socialists because we want the world to be a better place. And I think it's important not to mix those up and kind of get lost in the sauce in that sense.
I totally understand that. Like, I think that I understand why it can be important. Like, I understand the concerns with populism. There's a genuine high quality research genuinely seems to find that like populist movements, this sort of narrativizing, especially distrust of minorities, distrust of like the political process, distrust of democracy, these things all do seem to decrease democracy. I understand like the concern with that, if that's kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah. Like, but basically, you're very familiar probably with like the general critiques people have of populism. So yeah, just like those generally.
Yeah. So, but I guess the concern from my end is there is some evidence that like, so certain types of populism, especially those that are like anti-democracy or illiberal broadly, do seem to decrease democracy. But the populism of like, hey, here's an economic program that will benefit you and benefit America, I think that populism is not of the same type. I don't have the same procedural
I should clarify
concern.
that. So yeah. my main issue with populism is that populism tends to be very, very undermining of institutions. And I love me some institutions, and that's the main issue, is that like if we're talking left-wing or right-wing politics, right-wing or left-wing populism, a lot of them tend to undermine the value or the sanctity or the legitimacy of institutions. And I think that once you start like undermining those, you're getting into some really scary territory. But yeah, go on.
Well, sure, but so that's why I'm trying to distinguish like anti-elitism or like illiberalism versus popularism as like you are being denied things which should benefit you, which might be closer to what David Shore called like popularism. There are a lot of very popular economic positions which are substantially to the left of the current status quo, which should help us move in that direction. But having like a unifying story of that like, hey, this is the New Deal, this is the Green New Deal, this is socialism, this is democratic socialism, all of those are useful. There's literally evidence that like when you give people a word for an idea, it helps them fix it in their head. There's a reason we use words in the first place.
But also,
I'm not trying to get way too into like semantics.
Yeah,
but
I got you. But also by doing that, and this is a classic meme. Socialist knows this. I know because back when I was like I think when I was far more left leaning, I would see this sentiment go around all the time, where it's kind of like, oh, you know, if I just talk about my, this is like back when, I don't know, you're like I'm like a anarchist or whatever, anarcho-communist, whatever we're talking about. When I talk about my political system, everybody seems like, oh, you know, this is really cool, this is great, this is excellent. But as soon as you introduce the word socialist, like you've lost so many people instantly.
Yeah.
Just by virtue of how you call yourself. So sure, I can see that like calling yourself a socialist might be beneficial as like a rallying cry to some extent, but also you need to recognize the flip side of that, which is it just instinctually immediately turns so many people off.
So I totally understand that. Part of the reason I actually call myself is because I think that because I'm like to the left of like the mainstream, it's possible to some degree to want to try and pull people in that direction to make it less of a dirty word. I think the fact that Sanders, who is a self-described democratic socialist, did so well is an indicator that like we can also look at polling of people in the Democratic Party that like even in the United States, the left is shifting on that term. And that's useful because it lets us like, it's harder to just call a policy socialist and write it off. You have to now actually argue against single-payer healthcare, which lots of Dems did, but they couldn't just call it socialist like they did back in the 60s and 70s and successfully destroy it in the United States. I guess I'm just saying, like, I think that I understand the concern. I think it's a sort of like trying to renormalize, reclaim a word. That's if we're getting way into the words of just the word socialism. But I also don't really care. If someone calls themselves a soc dem or a social liberal and they care about 90% of the same policies, like as long as it's moving in my direction, as long as it's helping to normalize that, I think it's worthwhile.
Yeah,
you know?
and I don't necessarily see the same value in like reclaiming words like socialist, and like I mentioned before, with I see that there's a lot of things that can, because I think we both fundamentally agree that like socialism is it contains there are definitely key tenets and drivers and ideals intrinsic to socialism 100%, but socialism is also like a specific process through which we attain those ideals, right? Specific seems a bit of a weird word, but there's like a general like, oh, you know, decommodification, what were the other one? That's a decommodification, like
sure,
elimination
like class
of public
abolition,
class abolition,
decommodification.
Like decommodification.
There's a bundle.
Private ownership, you know, even money or states, depending on how far you want to go. But yeah,
I think part of the utility of socialism to me as well is actually that it has some theoretical baggage, and I think that theoretical baggage is often really stupid. But a big chunk of it, especially the bits, like the market socialist bits, I find really inspiring. So like one reformist socialist spoke on something related to this, that like there's utopia, which is like the long-term goal, our moral goals, our like imaginary society, and then there's incremental reform, and that's what we're actually doing politics day to day. It's trying to get, you know, expanded welfare benefits, it's trying to get like more union power, whatever. But you need something linking the two. And he calls that provisional utopia. It's this idea of an experimental reaching out towards utopia, trying it out and possibly failing and going back. That's why I think the story is useful, because it's linking people back to these stories of where utopia might be, and not just, I don't just want people committed to the incremental reforms. I want them committed to the experimentation. Is I guess my argument. They need the provisional utopia too, not just the provisional utopia.
Yeah, and so essentially, like what you're saying is that, and I can agree with this to some, absolutely. In terms of like, okay, let's say, so both of us are in favor of experimentation when it comes to more worker cooperatives, right? We read through the policies before. Now, what's going to be more effective? Like a big thing about, you know, oh, you know, through this experimentation, we can get closer towards a practical and material implementation of a socialist mode of production in which we're going to be able to attain like these and these principles and standards that have been a long part stay in the socialist tradition, or like, you know, some more like liberal thing like, well, we can improve our production output, we can improve worker satisfaction in the firms, we can lead to lower hazard rates, we can lead to more compressed wage hierarchies, and like, yeah, how the former is a lot more rhetorically efficacious there than the latter. And I see that now. Probably need to, and this is something I probably need to think about more. How do you, because I've given a lot of critiques of packaging your politics with a process or with the label of socialism and stuff like that. So I'd probably need to think of a way to be able to, for like a generally effective, broad rhetorical packaging for worker cooperatives that wouldn't invoke that if I want to be able to make that critique consistent.
It's called super capitalism.
True, that's the one.
Capitalism is so good. Where's capitalism too?
Oh, wait, here it is.
Cooperative capitalism.
Exactly. Yeah.
I guess. So like a big idea in democratic theory is that most voters don't deeply understand politics. Until recently in America, I think America recently hit 10% of voters who voted for ideological reasons, meaning they said like, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, I care about these policies. Most voters do it because they think the parties give them concrete benefits, or they have like structural linkages, like a church or a union or whatever, linking them to the party. So the reason packaging is important is in part because you have to sell a story to more than just the 1% of people who are politically engaged, more than just the 10% of people who like volunteer for campaigns, but to like 51% of the population, most of whom do not give a shit about any of this. So that's why you need words, you need ideas to communicate this to them. You need a package and a label. That's the point.
Yeah, and I understand that, and
that's why YIMBY, just as an aside, that's why YIMBY is so useful. It's a name, YIMBY, for a package of policies. Some of which, I mean, some libertarians might like that, I don't necessarily, but having that name bundles people together into a movement where there wasn't one before.
Yeah, and here's the thing, fundamentally, and I don't know if this is even something that can be perfectly resolved, or if this is just like an inherent difficulty that's going to be there no matter what. How with more measured like rhetoric and things like this, with less populism, you are less likely to get super carried away and end up with like a huge like revolutionary or radical shift failure or whatever. However, that also opens you up to like an argument that I think is reasonable, which is that you might be blind to the passive violence that exists in the system as is, right? However,
like
then
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but then alternatively, if you engage in more like I don't know if inflammatory is the right word, but more spirited, we can call it, rhetoric and stuff like that, where you invoke more populist tropes and, you know, specific things like, you know, socialist traditions or whatever, how you're more easily going to shift us out of the current passive violence that exists, but you're also committing yourself to a greater risk of it kind of like going out of control a bit and leading to worse outcomes in that way.
I think that one of the things, so like when you read through a lot of socialist excesses, they came in countries with very weak traditions of democracy, of recent revolution, which means like mass trauma, mass violence, mass inculcation of that in people, and where political expression was like severely curtailed. I think, like, I don't want to sing praises of democracy all the time, but like, I think part of the benefit of democracy is that it provides people outlets, and it tends to discourage like mass insane violence, mass like radical violence in a way that like systems which deny people that ability do. Like I think democracy tends to encourage people to seek out concrete policy goals more so than like if they're stuck in the realm of imagination and ideology. I guess would be my argument that like a lot of the excesses we saw of socialists going insane and doing like the Cultural Revolution and just beating people in the streets for no goddamn reason. It comes down to like the revolutionary tradition, the recent history of trauma that wouldn't be true in the vast majority of rich countries. And there isn't going to be a revolution in the rich countries. Like the US military, something I want to talk about sometime. I want to do a video titled like, you should be scared of the US military because like Iraq had the 4th largest military in the world. It was gone in 26 days.
I had conversations about this of like more Second Amendment conservative people that are like, we need to all be armed because like we'll be able to mount a guerrilla resistance should the U.S. like government and the military fight. Like, no, motherfucker. Like, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you might be able to do a guerrilla resistance, but you won't control territory. Like, if you think what the Taliban was doing for 21 years was winning, you're wrong. What they were doing was holding on until the Americans lost political will and pulled out. But they'll never lose political will in a domestic fight. Like Assad isn't losing domestic will. He's lost a third of his country. He still has complete political will. Like,
yeah, exactly. And I agree with you with that. But so the thing about how the thing's getting out of control, that being that being mitigated by having more like developed and institutions within the nation to begin with, I think that's a good argument, and that's probably something you need to consider more, because the reason why I tend to lean a bit more towards the more incrementalism compared to like the radical shifts, but I mean I'm thinking about this more, and this conversation is at least encouraging me to reconsider this a bit more, is because I think we would both agree with this, right? The majority of like radical shifts throughout human history have led to some pretty destructive consequences that are, on the whole, probably worse, and led to more harm than there were benefits. With few very, very notable exceptions where you've had a radical shift and you've actually been put in a significantly better place now as compared to where you were before. Would you agree with that? And this is like a super broad historical question, but
I want to do you know the famous quote by Zhu and Lai about the French Revolution?
No.
Someone asked him, what do you think the effects of the French Revolution was? And he says, we have yet to find out. Okay,
yeah. So essentially, you put yourself in a position where you might be in a worse off spot in the short term, but you fundamentally, you open up like a new door, a new avenue for potential future growth.
I mean, it's really hard to know, I think, because like feudalism was defeated. Mike and I had a conversation before the stream where I think we were talking about Eric Olin Wright, I believe, who said that feudalism was defeated with 1,000 cuts. And a lot of them were idiotic, and a lot of them were stupid. But like the long march towards like the type of system that capitalism has was generally an improvement in the long run. And it was probably worthwhile. It was probably worth some of that violence, some of that risk. And I think that like there's less explicit violence, but you were talking about the implicit violence of the system. Like there's the old Stephen Jay Gould quote. I know I'm just throwing about a bunch of quotes, but they're inspiring to me, so that's why I'm pulling it out. I don't care how Einstein's brain worked when I know that there are thousands of Einsteins who died in the cotton fields, who died in the sweatshops. I just think like when we're faced with a world of so much poverty and so much like this is why I think that moving people towards social democracy pretty rapidly, at least, is like that should be like the bare minimum. Like I want to move as far left as the experiments have shown us, like now, immediately, because that will give us a million more scientists willing to study this, a million more people willing to try out cooperatives.
Yeah, and here's my question to you, and this might be like a fundamental differentiation in optimism, where I might be no, never mind. It would be the opposite still. Never mind. I'm still accusing you of being a utopian. No, I'm kidding. But
okay, idealist.
Okay, yeah, true. Okay, idealist. Okay, where if you, this is like another pretty broad theory, but this is kind of like what this type of discussion necessitates, right? It's not going to be like an empirical discussion when we're talking about things like this necessarily. But if you think of like the 100 most likely paradigm shifts that we might go from where we are right now, from like the neoliberal paradigm we exist within today, do you believe that there are more of those which are beneficial to human happiness, or more which are harmful to human happiness?
I mean, that's such a broad question. It kind of depends whether it's left or right. Because I think the right is building out a new form of like fascist theory. If you ever read into like neo-reactionary stuff or see like their new theorists, they're all arguing for illiberalism and the decline of democracy. So that stuff frightens me greatly. I think I've long argued, like, the greatest threat in the United States is Republicans by any means. Any centrist who's like worried about socialists while Republicans are actively gerrymandering their way to majority power is lost in the sauce.
It's like, I think even Trump, what was he said? He said the Republican Party is the world's most whatever terrorist organization. Didn't he say something like that? I think so, right? I think Chomsky said something like that. Hold on, let me see if I can find that quote. But yeah, keep going. I'm going to look for the quote in the meantime.
Well, so I guess on the right, I basically have all fear. So I guess like 50% I think are worse.
And so you think it's like 50-50 there?
But like on the left, I do have a lot of concerns about a lot of leftist things. But I think like most things that people on the left want, like there's some who want protectionism. There's some who want like NIMBY approaches. There's lots of people who like want to rebuild industry in America that just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
You know,
there's the
go ahead.
Yeah. What worries me the most is that I see. Okay, the quote, by the way, the Republican Party is the most dangerous organization in human history. Is what Chomsky said. But the main worry.
You said Trump, which made chat.
Oh, did I say Trump before?
Yeah. Based Trump, pro-terrorism Trump.
Oh, wait, did Trump say that? Oh, no. Okay. Did I say... Oh, fuck. I meant Chomsky.
Yeah.
Okay. How do I confuse the two of those? Okay, whatever. Regardless. Moving on. The main thing I see that worries me, and unfortunately this is something I see in both the left and the right, although more on the right, but it's getting closer, and I don't like it. Where you see more people, and I can understand why this is happening, but you see more people fundamentally undercutting and undermining important institutions that exist. How you have more people talking about how, like, fundamentally, like the very fabric, the very tools, the very skeleton that we use in order to maneuver this political, ideological, social, cultural project that is our nation is fundamentally broken. And that type of rhetoric, I think, is very conducive towards extra legal, which does not mean, bonus legal, super on top, making sure you follow the legal guidelines, but it means quite the opposite of like extra legal, more revolutionary action in order to like accomplish the things that you want to do. And those types of things tend not to have really good, really good outcomes.
Well, so like I said before, there's one shit study from the Blair Institute. I don't actually know what it's called, but it's Tony Blair's Institute, which said that populism led to decreases in democracy. And that one sucks because it uses a bad measure of populism and a bad measure of democracy. Okay. But the study was more or less recreated by the V-Dem Institute, which has a much better definition of democracy and a much better definition of illiberalism. And they found that when illiberal people take power, there's I want to say it's a 3 in 10 chance that democracy will decline in their country, compared to a 6 in 100 chance if it's not an illiberal person. So illiberal rhetoric, like, it does correlate with decline in democracy. I think it's a very real threat. Yeah. It's why I'm so worried about Republicans, because they have the rhetoric. They've been doing it in the States. If they have the federal power, they very well might move the United States right for like 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
But like, I guess I think the causes of that have to do with like increased online politics, increased salience of culture. If there's one unifying theory, it's probably David Shore and education polarization. What we're seeing right now is that the first time in human history, it's possible to win or almost win elections if you win the college educateds and like another 10, 20%. That means you can run on socially liberal values in a way you just couldn't do ever before. And I think that's why people are focused on them so much. And I hope, the hope is that education polarization won't matter once we get to like 50% college educated, 60%, because then you can't win on the uneducated vote, which is much more socially conservative. So then maybe some of this will go away and it'll go back to being more economic focused. It's not really clear, but I think we're living through a period where there's no precedent in history. There's never been a time period where you could try and win the socially liberal educated vote and win. And so that's why it's the first time we've ever seen it in history.
Yeah. And I understand where you're coming from with that. It's just that like the the thing specifically about like the undermining of institutions that very much bothers me is what the fuck, I sound like XQC right now. What is wrong with me? Okay, the thing that very much bothers me with that is that if you fundamentally if you think that the tools you have for change are broken, then it leaves no recourse except for violence. And that's why I'm really worried about being carried away into populist things, because they tend to undermine the tools more than the outcomes of the way that those tools are applied today.
I mean, I think the next 20 to 30 years are going to be some of the most harrowing years for democracy since the 1930s, 1920s and 30s. Because the 1920s and 30s saw the right wing rise up, a lot like we're seeing the right rise up now. We saw illiberalism rise up in countries, including in leftist countries. And so I think that we are seeing an analogous moment. And I do think that, like, to some degree, that's like, if you look at the countries which survived democratically during that time period, it's the ones where the center and the center left and some of the left grafted themselves together and like made a sort of pro-democracy left. I don't like all of the policies they came up with. Like Sweden was sort of leaning pro-Nazi during parts of the war.
That was very, yeah, we did a lot of like the eugenicist things that Nazis based a lot of the research, and then we were completely neutral. And when the Nazis essentially came to Sweden, we're just like, whatever, do what you want, you know.
I guess I'm just like, I think when you look leftward, you find, in general, I know there's some very loud voices who are like anti-democracy on the left, but in general, I think evidence tends to show that people on the left tend to be more pro-democracy. They tend to care more about it. They care more about institutions. And a lot of that, I don't actually know, is because of leftist ideology. It's actually because of education polarization again. Like, I think that if you care about democracy to some degree, you want to graft yourself to the side which is more education polarized, because those people care about the institutions. So like, this is like, I guess I'm just saying, even from like a centrist perspective, I think it's very hard not want to lean towards the left. Because when you look at the people who are most willing to want to, like, I don't know, prosecute Trump or eliminate the Senate and like try and make things more democratic, try and like protect voter rights, it's generally the left of the Democratic Party, not the right.
Yeah, but we're at the point still where, at least I think that, you know, that the midterms aren't yet. No, that midterms are later this year, right? And
they're in like 2 months.
Exactly. And then in 2024, I think we are going to see more Republicans in office than we see right now. Would you agree with that? Or
it's very likely.
Yeah. So even though, like, you know, it's all fine to say like, hey, we have more educated people alive than ever before today that are part of the voting population, so therefore we're more incentivized to kind of appeal to them, and because they have a higher trust in institutions, the rhetoric is going to be a bit tempered by that. But regardless of that, we still see like a very real risk of, you know, more like right-wing people coming into power and being able to to essentially take power and lead the country into one of those right-wing 100 paradigms that we talked about before, right?
So I think that, like, in the short run, that's a really big risk. I think this is the argument for like a sort of survival popularism, that the left should consider like moderating a few of its positions. It should try tacking a little bit to the right just to try and preserve democracy. I think that's a totally acceptable position. If you care about democracy deeply enough to like worry about that. It's sort of David Shore's position that like we should talk a little bit less loudly about social issues, especially guns, maybe, especially immigration, maybe, which sucks because I think the United States is doing like one of the biggest human rights abuses on the border. But if Republicans get in, they'll double or triple it. I don't know. I don't know what the right approach is. I do think there's a concern about messaging. And I do think that as much as possible, the Democratic Party in the United States should try to message in a way that can get the popular vote. But I guess my argument in the long run is that like normalizing, moving in these directions of being able to experiment leftward again, I think is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and my policy positions reflect that. But it's just like the rhetoric thing that I'm still I'm so because of the way that I've just seen populism take root and hold, you know, under the very like relatively short period of time that I've been interested in politics, you know, being a very young person myself. You know, I've seen Trump, I've seen Boris Johnson, I've seen the rise of the Sweden Democrats over here, and I see all these things happening, and like Yeah, I'm just super allergic and super worried about the rise of populism. So that's why I'm very careful with the way that I talk about these things, and with my rhetoric and with attaching myself to like broader narratives and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I understand the concern there because there have been a lot of failures and they have seen pushback. I understand that. I guess I just think that, like, in the long run, if we want to see a society where not just like the most left societies on Earth are like the social democracies you'd like to see, but like the whole world, you need a movement that's bigger than just like, hey, here are these cool policies. Why doesn't, all of academic Twitter should get behind me, and maybe that'll be enough for like a political movement.
Yeah, of course
you need
not.
to be able to communicate that downward.
Yeah,
that's all.
And then it's, so do you think it's significantly weaker to rally behind principles than it is towards ideologies?
It's a mixture. So one of the weird problems. This is actually something that polling has addressed in the United States. On policies. Americans are more left than they are on ideology. About like a third of Americans say they're conservative, as opposed to only a fifth say they're liberal. But if you ask Americans, most of them support like worker earner funds, like the Meidner plan. It's like it gets like 70% support.
Yeah.
So a big problem is that.
But you also need to. But it also needs to be tempered relative to the importance for them as voters of something like the Meidner plan compared to, I don't know, fucking trans drag shows or whatever it is, unfortunately, like what's going to take voting
social issues
priority.
It's a lot more 50-50.
But not just that. Sorry, that's not just what I'm saying. I'm saying that like even though, if you ask somebody specifically, hey, what would you think about this policy, you might have 90% approval of that. But even though there's 90% approval for this policy, that policy might still be, position 27 on voter priorities, right? That's the point.
So that's the term for that is salience. That some issues are more salient than others, and economic issues are less salient because it's basically a fight on social issues between the increasingly educated and the increasingly uneducated parties across Europe and across the United States and even across the world. So I totally like. The salience of like economic issues is really low, which is bad for the left. This is the argument that talk less about social issues and nonstop talk about like single payer healthcare or something, because that's will bring it up in salience and that'll encourage people to vote for you. That's the sure argument, essentially, that like the messaging around policies should be economic policies. But I guess the argument I'm trying to give is that...
But couldn't it also become the case then that now you're suddenly talking about something that nobody really cares a lot about, so they might be more inclined towards voting for or paying attention to the people that are talking about something you care about?
As far as I'm aware, so David Shore did a lecture on this, and I can send it to you. One of the things they do is decompose voter shifts from 2012 to 2016 and 2016 to 2020. So those are the presidential elections. And I want to say in both of them, it was 2/3 and like 3/4 of people who changed their vote. 2/3 to 3/4 of the shift in percentage vote by either party was due to persuasion, meaning people changing their vote from one party or the other.
Oh wow,
Only
really? That's
a third or a fourth was turnout. So the other question is turnout and persuasion, do they have different like? Are different issues more important? And the answer is no. Economic issues are better at turnout and at persuasion for the Democratic Party.
So wait, so just to understand what I said, so did you say 3/4 of the voters were put there as like a part of persuasion?
Yeah. Like the story of why 2016 went Republican and why 2020 went Dem is mostly persuasion. People voted Republican and then they voted Democrat.
Okay.
So unfortunately, like from my perspective, this is somewhat unfortunate. It means that the marginal voter, some idiot out in like, I don't know, like Michigan, who never watches the news, that's the guy we got to target. And
that's
they are persuaded by economic issues.
Sympathetic of you, SDL.
I am sympathetic to the working class. I am less sympathetic to people who barely know about politics but demand that their swing state run my life.
Okay, wow. I'm sympathetic to the working class, except for the working class in Michigan. God bless. Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to the working class, except the 49% of the working class that votes Republican.
True.
Okay, those ones can.
Yeah, exactly. That's a classic. Okay. No, I see what you mean. What inclined you to bring up the this entire culture versus economic issue conversation? Where were we before that?
Well, because you were concerned about democracy falling apart. And I think the reason I was bringing that up is I don't think that's because like socialist ideas are getting more popular. I think it's because of education
So to be
polarization.
clear, it's not because I think socialist ideas are becoming more popular. I think that I'm afraid of our democracy falling apart because populism as like a form of rhetoric is becoming more popular. And when populism as a form of rhetoric lends itself towards the discrediting of institutions, that's where I feel the threat comes from. So it's nothing inherent to like socialism, you know, poses a unique threat to our democracy. It's populism that does that.
Yeah, so I agree with that. But one of the things I guess I'm trying to argue is that there's a variety of research I could point you to that like educated people are more informed, more inclined towards our institutions, and less susceptible to like populist messages. So the reason I brought it up in part was I think populism is happening right now because it's possible to win a populist right-wing coalition, unlike before, because uneducated people who would be attracted to populist rhetoric were roughly evenly split, for example, in the United States, Dem and Republican parties until like the 70s, 80s, 90s. But since then, there's been a dramatic shift in the composition. Educateds are very, very democratic, so it's very easy to win a populist Republican ticket. That's the concern, that like we are a uniquely populist like time period, but that will hopefully fade as people get educated, assuming the Republicans don't like shut down colleges or something.
Which is unfortunately something they've been doing more and more, right? How like
it is one of the
these
things
higher
they're going to try
educations
to
like a leftist indoctrination camp, and you know all the comics of like, you know, I'm going to send my kid to college, and they come back and they have like 63 piercings, blue hair, and are wearing like a Karl Marx shirt,
absolutely, right? Based. You know, one of the things there's actually research that shows that how left the professors of a college are has nothing to do with how far left someone goes for being in college. It's just getting educated. People just fucking learn about the world, and they're like, oh my god, I like equality and freedom. I don't know.
That feels intuitively surprising to me.
It's a little intuitively surprising, but it did show, like, it was a study of, I want to say, like half the universities in California, so I'm willing to trust it. I can send it over.
Okay, but if it's all in California, they're all socialist in California anyway, so you have no control group.
They started with blue hair and they came out with pink hair. What's the difference?
Exactly, true, so true. So in this one they analyzed different colleges that or universities, and some of them had like self-identified more right-wing or center professors.
So I said half of California. I don't actually know what percent this is. It's probably much lower. Okay. But here, I sent it over. It is Mariani et al. 2008. Okay. And what they did is they asked the faculty of a college whether they were like left or right. And they compared
one college only, or?
No, sorry. Among 47 four-year colleges.
Okay.
So a bunch. And they found that it didn't matter what the faculty orientation was for the change in orientation among people who entered college.
So did they find like was it insignificant, or was the effect size just really small?
The beta looks like, let's see, what's the intercept?
Because it just feels like from everything I know about like human bias and just like the way people form their opinions about the people around them, that seems just so incredibly surprising to me. But it could very well be true. But yeah, well,
one of the things that's possible is that it's actually selection effect and that group effect that you're talking about. That educated people tend to be more left. Educated people,
you're already selecting once they're already at university, right?
You're selecting the ones who are. We also know that conservative students have more negative views towards education. They're less likely to want to go to education. They're less likely to pursue it. Even though their grades are like roughly the same, they don't go as far in education as liberals do. And one concern for this is like maybe it's liberals like pushing out all the conservatives. There doesn't seem to be any evidence, as far as I'm aware, of that, of like systemic bias against conservatives. It just seems to be that like liberals really like being in education and conservatives really want to get out.
Do you think that if this was replicated in like high school, do you think similar results will be found?
No, because it's mandatory. I think that you'd have almost, because I think the effect is selection. And I think if you get rid of selection, I don't think you'd see it.
Okay, so do you think if this was done in high school, they would find a connection between the ideology of the teachers and the students?
Oh no, I mean, I guess I choose to interpret these results as like, I'm sure teacher ideology has some effect, but it seems like it's small.
Yeah, exactly. Especially like from what the study says in college, it absolutely seems to be. But I'm curious, what do you think that would look like in high school?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would hope it would look pretty similar, like that. Like each year of education moves to people to the left or something. Because I guess the argument is that I think the causal effect here is in part that the right, conservative appeals often don't work to people who are more aware of like history, to people who are more like media savvy. If you just look at like the media that Trump puts out, it's very different than the media that like Pelosi puts out or Biden puts out. Trump, I mean, there's that one study that like Trump speaks at like a 6th grade level. He's one of the he speaks at like one of the easiest to comprehend levels of American presidents, and that's really helpful in part because he's appealing to a coalition which really hates education and despises like the language of social justice and the language of colleges and all the fancy titles and words.
Okay, yeah. So essentially, what you're saying is that if the left just tempers their rhetoric a little bit so they capture more of the uneducated population while still very, very distinctly remaining true to the fundamental like institutional principles that educated people seem to prioritize, you're able to eliminate the capability for the conservatives to build an entire voter base solely on the basis of appealing to less educated people, and at the same time you're able to have the left capture that population to a greater extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the argument is it's like I've called it like a survival vote or a survival coalition or something, that like if you genuinely think there's a risk of democracy being destroyed, which I do, of like Republicans trying to remove the political power of their opponents, which I do based on what they've been doing in the states, then it becomes worth it to like try and moderate if that can get us more votes on like social issues. At least in terms of rhetoric. I think that one of the big ideas of David Shore is a fancy word for lying called preference falsification, that you should just talk less about immigration.
Facts. That's what that sounds like. Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. Talk less about immigration. Don't highlight it. Don't talk about guns. Don't highlight it. But like you can still try on the back end, like if with executive power or whatever, try and do things that like benefit these areas. You just have to. I don't know. I don't know quite what the right approach is.
Do we have historical examples of like really really significant, really well-known elections being won on the basis of an economic platform principally, as opposed to cultural ones? I would imagine elections around, like, for example, the Great Depression in the US would be like examples of this.
I know that so in studies of Nazi Germany, which I was recently doing because I think Vausch was talking about it, so I looked into it.
Okay.
The classical Marxist idea was that the Nazis were supported by the bourgeois, like the petit bourgeois and the big bourgeois, rich people.
And that wasn't true at all, if I don't remember.
I think it seems to be true, is actually my reading. That like if you look at unemployed people and workers, they voted increasingly for the communist and the socialist. The unemployed voted communist and the workers voted socialist. But the self-employed, which is mostly farmers and small business people, and the firm owners voted increasingly for Nazis.
The big bourgeoisie as well. Am I misremembering from my history?
The elite of the country was actually even more right-leaning. There's this one really neat graph I have. Nazi elite. It was an estimate from famous people's biographies at the time period. So take that with a grain of salt. But their estimate was that roughly 44% of the country's elites, like big journalists, big business people, and so on, leaned towards the Nazis, or were monarchists, or were national conservatives, even before the Nazis took power.
Okay.
And so, like, the reason that matters, I think, is right now, one of the hopeful things I have for democracy is that the elite of this country are very educated. And I think this would look like a very different picture than it does in Nazi Germany and most fascist countries. So one of the weird things about education polarization is before like 1950 or so, the powerful people, the most educated people tended to be more conservative because they were richer, they were wealthier, and so on. But now, powerful, educated people tend to be slightly more left on social issues, and they care more about democracy. One of my hopes is quite literally that like the institutions are stronger because the people care more about democracy and they won't side with a fascist coup. But they did in Nazi Germany because they were very conservative.
Yeah, fuck. I want to find my I'm going back to. I'm currently in Amsterdam right now, and I'm going back because here's where I study. But I'm going back to Sweden, like during the summer for parts of it, and I want to find my goddamn textbook because I did higher level history in my for my IB, and we talked about Nazi Germany. And there have been so many times like they're doing this that stuff has come up, and I'm like, I remember we talked about this in class, but I don't remember exactly what they found. So I want to find that fucking notebook so bad. That's gonna be one of my major tasks over summer, finding my old history notebook. But
yeah, I mean, so this is a very debated thesis, and there are plenty of articles which oppose it. I just tend to think that. So I read through like, I don't know, 10 of these, and I was like, well, I think the strongest ones seem to be that like the unemployed, the Catholics, and the workers didn't vote for the Nazis. The Catholics voted for the center, the unemployed voted for the commies, the workers voted for the socialists, and everyone else voted Nazi. The Protestants, and especially the business owners, they voted Nazi. And so I guess I just bring all that up because like the hope is that like the institutions, like, I don't know, literally the CIA, the FBI, the military won't align with like fascism or like a junta or a coup approach because they're more educated and they care more about democracy. I know one of the weirder shifts is that the class that's most overrepresented in the U.S. military is no longer the poor. It changed around like 2000 or so. Now the most overrepresented class is the middle class.
I've heard this.
Which hopefully inclines them to not support a fascist coup. Yeah. I mean, here's hoping, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I gotcha. Oh, fuck, I want to find that history notebook so bad. That's all I've been thinking about since we brought up the Nazi stuff. All right. Yeah. Was there anything else that you had on your mind in relation to this?
You asked about ideology versus policies. One that just relates to like why
principles.
Why is
I meant principles, not policies.
Yeah. Excuse me.
No worries.
The idea is just that like the principles of America are very conservative. One of the reasons that I want to pull those left is that then you can appeal to people on ideology and policies. Right now, you have to appeal to them on policy.
So sorry, maybe I wasn't clear before. So I wasn't asking ideology or policy. I was asking ideology or principles. Because
I guess I kind of equated the two.
I
mean, I guess there's probably some distinction, but like for the purposes of like the average voter, I think it mostly just comes down to like, you know, do they care about egalitarianism or do they care more about like part of the reason the United States has a weaker welfare system than other countries is because people don't want welfare to go to people who aren't white. White people don't want welfare to go to people who aren't white. And so like part of the reason of like wanting to shift principles and ideology leftward is that people have like explicitly a commitment against that kind of thinking.
Yeah. So to clarify, when I talked about the distinction before, is that so you have all these principles that underlie socialism. You have, you know, egalitarianism, you have democracy, you have all these things that are positive freedom. That there are core principles of socialism, but then also embedded within socialism is a history of pathing towards like achieving those principles. And my entire thing was effectively like, I am worried that if we attach ourselves to something that has a particular pathing, then we're attaching ourselves too much to a process as compared to an outcome. However, if we try to focus our rhetoric more around the principles, then we can still get that kind of like that rhetorical strategization there, while not committing ourselves to like a specific path by which to get there, and therefore minimizing the risks of like this entire thing like spinning out of control or whatever.
So I think that this is one of the reasons that I approach things from like that I argue for the experimentalist sort of approach, that like it puts less risk of being like, this is the policy to do. This is like the thing we have to do at any means necessary. And it encourages more sort of like, we should try a bunch of these things and some might not work out, but we should figure it out. We should experiment and stick with the leftward shifts that do. I think the explicit commitment to that, I think is useful. Like, I think I do want to like the narrative, the idea that the term socialism is useful because it's like an inspiring goal for people. But I think that like at the upper levels of like socialist writing, I know I'm kind of rambling a bit. Like socialist writing in America has been dominated by market socialist reformists for like decades. And I think that that's hopeful to me that like the movement, when it gets power, will tend to approach it with that sort of experimental approach, and that's good. We should want a sort of cautious experimentalism that can hopefully inspire people.
So if I ask you then, for example, like what's the difference between rallying around principles and rallying around ideology? Do you see any difference there?
I think that it's just which terms you use. Like, I maybe this is a bigger distinction you're trying to draw between like egalitarianism versus socialism.
I am, because the distinction I'm trying to draw there is that egalitarianism is an end goal, whereas socialism has a history of policies and pathings towards that goal, like wrapped up in it as well. And that's what I see the distinction is. So while if you're arguing for like specific principles and you're rallying around the principles, you're rallying around the end goal. Whereas if you're rallying around socialism, you're rallying around those principles, but also a history of policies and paths that have been attempted in order to get closer towards that goal.
I think what I said earlier is that I think some of that tradition is useful, and encouraging people to ground themselves in that is useful too. Like, I think that good advocates for liberalism also are like well read in the philosophers of liberalism, especially the left end, like John Rawls. I think there's sort of a similar analogy for socialism, that I think that social democracy is at one level a set of policies, but at another level it's a commitment to those policies for principled reasons and for ideological reasons, and tying yourself to that, understanding why they were developed that way, understanding how to make them stick is important. And I think that tying yourself to the term encourages people to read that history, to understand that, basically to understand like how we got here, the path of how we got here, and maybe how to stick here next time, right? How to stay closer to that and not have another neoliberal era of 40 years.
Do you feel like the aggregate history of socialist movements has been positive or negative?
Fortunately, I get to do a little semantics here. All of the ones that were bad were communist.
Oh, okay.
But I guess I would say, like,
so you would draw a very clear distinction between.
I would not. No, that's just semantics. I do think most socialist movements throughout history, because of their advocacy for revolution, were probably a net negative, because they prevented real democracy. And as a result, I think they produced authoritarian systems that hurt a lot of people.
Okay.
I think the economic results were like good for the first 20, 30 years often, because they did this sort of forced developmental state sort of approach. But they failed. They did not work for like building complex industrialized economies. And because they fucked up the democracy so bad, they couldn't fucking reform.
So then my question is fundamentally, why attach yourself to a net negative history when you can avoid that, but still commit yourself to the principles and get like the rhetorical benefits that comes from that?
I think that the idea is that there's another history. There's a book that I have not read called Europe's Socialist Revolution, because after World War II, SocDems, who were nominally committed to building socialism, won and held power for roughly like 40% of the time period until the 1980s. There's another history of socialism, another history of like the move to left that I think people should tie themselves to and should understand, because those movements helped build. I guess the argument I'm saying is like those movements helped build a lot of the things we care about today. Like fights for workers' rights were intricately tied to the building out of democracy. They were intricately tied to building out of welfare and so on. It's impossible to imagine the world we live in today without a genuine socialist movement called the Social Democrats, who failed. They didn't get to socialism, but we wouldn't live in the world today if it had just gone back to centrists.
I understand. So, but then it feels like this. So, if you rally around socialism, you rally around a history that, number one, to the average person, when they think about the history of the pathing of socialism, they're going to think of net negative things. If even you and I, who are more socialistically inclined, one might say, it sounds like a huge dog whistle. If both of us also see that, like, on the net, a lot of, a lot of movements that call themselves socialist movements were net negative. But there also is a history of there being a very clear, distinct socialist traditions in a lot of the movements that were beneficial towards workers' rights and therefore welfare and labor conditions and stuff like that, then it just feels like it's so much groundwork you have to lay and so many like preconceived notions you have to be able to, handwave is the wrong word, but you have to be able to dispel in order to be able to center your rhetoric that way, as opposed to if you talk about like principles and stuff like that fundamentally, then you attach yourself to principles, not necessarily to any one specific history of progress towards those principles, and that way it becomes easier for you establish those principles, you rally behind those, and then you can still attach yourself to the successful and the examples that we want to pull from, we want to point to as good cases of, in this case, like socialist movements accomplishing things that are beneficial for human well-being, right?
So I get that. I am totally fine with people, like, they want to call themselves a progressive, a social democrat, right? Especially, Eddie,
honey.
I totally understand why people would want to do that, because there is like a lot of history to clear up. But I think it's telling that when Sanders adds one word to socialism, democratic socialism, now apparently it's just fine. I think I did a thread on this once.
Okay. I know among young people, the word is, what's the approval for the word, for socialism amongst young people?
So I did a thread on this because the word socialism is actually fairly popular. But a lot of socialist policies, like concrete policies like class abolition, are a lot less popular when you get down into like the weeds of it. I know one funny one is if you ask people whether it's morally wrong for society to have billionaires, about 20% of people say it's morally wrong, including I think 30% of Dems and 10% of Republicans who had just voted for a fucking billionaire. So there's a lot of people who have like very confused views on this, but the word itself is gaining in popularity, especially among young people. And so I think part of the hope is like, that's good. I want to encourage that. And eventually it won't be an issue. That's the goal, is like to shift the fundamental principles that people care about. I know I'm kind of talking around your question, but it's like, I think that the two are intertwined. I don't think that you can.
Yeah. My entire thing is just like, is it worth it? And for the reasons I've laid out, and for the way that I analyze this now for you and for everybody else, to me, it seems difficult for me to be convinced by that case.
Sure. I mean, so I think that, I think one of my roles is like, I'm just a fucking dude on the internet, you know? My role isn't necessarily to do
micro celebrity. Yes.
Yeah. My role isn't necessarily to do the messaging for the Democratic Party. I should generally try and do like good messaging, but it's also like an Overton window sort of approach, right? It's this approach of like trying to change what policies are allowed to talk about.
So essentially your thing is like, if you attach yourself to a position that may even be more left-wing than you might be, it's going to do a better job of kind of pulling and tugging the Overton window as a whole further to the left.
Yeah, and to be clear, I would consider myself a socialist. I know in like a lot of in the discussion I had with Micah, I'm very talking about experiments and like just do as far as we can, then do a few steps left. But like after we do a few steps left, we'll pick out the ones that work, and then we'll do it again, and then we'll do it again. Like I'm not going to be satisfied, I guess, with like the slightly imaginary Sweden, as it were. But yeah, it's the argument is, especially attaching yourself to specific policies is also very useful too. Like Matt Bruenig did more to bring back social wealth funds as an idea than any other man on earth, just because he kept talking about it. And Bernie Sanders did more to get the $15 minimum wage and single-payer healthcare into the conversation just by talking about it. There's so much evidence that media can convince people. Yeah, just fucking talking about things works. So a combination of talking about policies and ideologies works, I think. And so does principles. It all fucking works.
Yeah. I would agree with absolutely most of the things you said there. That's a great way to sidestep the another infinite fractalization of upcoming talking points. But yeah, I think this was I enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed the conversations with the more like economy and this political theory conversations with Micah. I'm enjoying this conversation with you. So I think the maid catboy boy band trio, I'm gonna be talking to both of you more in the future, I think. But yeah,
sure. I guess if there's one closing argument that I'd give, it's that like I think one of the things we didn't talk about in that debate with Micah was like, Micah briefly talked about how it's going to be politically unfeasible for a lot of things I want in like the next 10, 20 years. And I totally agree. But I think part of the reason for that is because we have a whole class of people in this country whose like very strong incentives are to fuck over unions and workers' rights. Like Elon Musk, the moment that Tesla got like close to unionizing and the moment someone accused him, he went Republican, and he's complaining about unions nonstop now.
Yeah.
And
did you see the thing about the Musk and the accusation? How it was like, it was so crazy. Like he sent out that tweet after he'd been contacted for comment, and then he sent out the tweet and it was
sleazy.
Like, exactly. For those of you who don't know, basically there was I think it was a Business Insider, Forbes, I'm not sure. There was a big magazine that essentially published talking about an allegation against Elon Musk for sexual harassment. And the thing is, if you weren't super paying attention to it, what ended up happening is that Elon Musk declares himself a Republican. Elon Musk says political attacks against me are going to escalate dramatically. And then after that, there's an article that comes out about like sexual harassment allegations. And then they're like, wow, look at the lefty canceling machine. But what had actually happened is that magazine had reached out to Elon Musk way earlier before the tweet and asked him for a comment on it. And then after he had been asked for comment, Elon Musk, tweeted, which is like,
So the guy's sleazy, and he's like visibly a Republican now. He's like tweeting out like memes about how the left is too radical. He's like visibly supporting. He was before he was supportive of like the Republican governors, but now he's supporting like the Republican Party as a whole. He's talking about how evil the Democrats are, that he can't vote for a Democrat, which is insane. As someone that educated should have all the tools to realize that like Republicans are going to destroy democracy, but he doesn't care. I think that one of the very simple arguments that John Romer does in his argument for market socialism is compare the interests of a society where capital is owned by everyone versus capital is owned by a few at the top. And the answer is that if you're a few at the top, it's easier for you to support public bads. Pollution is easier to support because let's say it's 10% of the population owns all the capital. If you're only 10% of the population, you only get 10% of the hurts of pollution, but you get 100% of the benefits.
Yeah, and you also in most cases, you arguably don't even get the 10% of the negatives because you have more capital to insulate yourself against. Yeah, I love this. Yeah, exactly.
So the point is just like very simple theories make clear that like when wealth is power is concentrated in the rich, they will have different interests than other people. This is like class struggle 101, and it seems to be broadly correct. I gave this example before because it's insane, but a billionaire in Israel just fucking funded and founded a newspaper and moved the whole country like 6% rightward. Like it's the idea that one man could have that power is so frightening to me. I don't want anyone to exist like that in the world.
Yeah, do you think you can link me was there a study on that as well?
Yeah, I can pull it up. Yeah, it's still a preprint, so it's possible it won't pass peer review, but I thought it was a really good study.
Yeah. Oh wait, it's a preprint at the moment, so yeah.
I couldn't hear what you said.
Did you say it was a preprint at the moment?
It is a preprint, but I can still link the study.
It might still be peer reviewed. Some preprints have gone through peer review, but they're still at the process where they're adding a few amendments. So it might be something, I don't remember exactly what it was, but not all preprints are non-peer reviewed, but you should always check.
I mean, I say it's a preprint. I never really care about stuff like that. I think that it comes down to the methodology. And I want to say they had a good causal methodology. Okay. I forget what, but I don't remember. I'll go try and find it.
For reference, just because I'm not sure what education do you have on things related to this?
Give me one moment. I can't hear you at all.
Okay.
Okay, I'll have to find it in a moment. I can't find it easily. I'm sorry. Please repeat what you said.
Yeah. So what? Because you said that the methodology thing, which obviously it makes sense. But so what education do you have specifically on? Like things relevant to these type of studies. If you're fine disclosing that, I don't know if you're.
I mean, I have a BS in economics, and that's about it.
Okay. No, but that's still definitely.
I think a lot of good modern economics research is very empirical, and I very much tend towards that side. So
yeah. Okay. No, but that's fine. I was just curious because usually, like when I hear like you know, oh, you know, yeah, this study's isn't published or whatever. But I mean, you can read it. The numbers are all there. It's like, okay. Yeah, I initially some skepticism bells like ring off in my head, but yeah.
I think it's still a preprint. I can look for the full link.
Let's see. How the ultra-rich use media ownership as a political investment. Rich use.
And here's the PDF. Oh, and so they use 2-period first difference instrumental variable models. Instrumented. And so I think what they tried to do is prove causal relation by instrumenting with another right-wing newspaper, which I think made it plausible to me that this was a fully causal effect, or like close to it.
Uh-huh.
But
It's okay.
This is the author's accepted manuscript without copying,
ma'am.
formatting, or final corrections. It will be
No,
published in its final form. Okay, I see a tweet from them where they say, happy to update that it's been accepted for publication.
oh, cool.
But this tweet is from October 21, so it feels like...
It might have been published and I just didn't find it.
Yeah,
I thought it was good when I read it.
It might have been accepted, but it might come out in a bit of a later issue. It says published. This is published 2020.
It might have been published too. I might have read the preprint version.
Yeah, it feels strange that the tweet says it's been accepted for publication in 21, but then if I'm looking at Semantic Scholar, it says published 2020. And that's what's making me look. But yeah, I'll
I
see if
have
I can
absolutely no idea.
But yeah.
Ooh, no, it has been published.
It has been published.
Here's the link. I think, unless this is. No, this is the author's manuscript. Okay, it's been.
Okay, I found one without where it doesn't say author's manuscript, but it's just a PDF. I don't know if it does it have a DOI?
Oh my god.
Guy Gross. This is on his website. God fucking damn it, dude. This is January 22nd, 2021. Okay, was this published? Okay, DOI. Do you have a DOI? You do not have a DOI. Oh, for fuck's sake.
Okay.
We'll figure it out.
If it's published, I don't know where it is. So I think this is a 2022 paper. So the journal might not have what might happen is that it's been published, but the issue ain't come out yet.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. That's a possibility.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think it's a reasonably good study, and it aligns with a lot of other evidence that media persuades people, and billionaires can just fucking astroturf it. They can just fucking pay for it. Mm-hmm. And that's insane. I don't want I guess I've repeatedly said this, but it is so frightening to me that Elon Musk could just let's say he liquidated all of his Tesla shares tomorrow, only got a dime on the dollar for them, 10%. He'd still have $20 billion or something along those lines. He could fund Fox News for 20 years just on his own. That's insane. I despise the fact that that's possible.
Mm-hmm. No, I see what you mean, definitely. Yeah, it's game theory. That's what a lot of this eventually comes down to. I get you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll take a look at that. I'll read through it. And I look forward to the upcoming the co-ops with all the mathematical proofs that I've assigned
when I can
to
find.
both of you guys in
Oh my
homework.
god. It's some okay. Yep, that's a good point to end it. I can't wait for the mathematics. Thank you, teacher Rose Wrist. We'll all come back in femboy outfits and cat ears.
Let's go. That's a school uniform at the Academy of Rose Wrist. Okay. Oh boy, that sounds like I'm creating a cult. It's not. I promise you guys. I don't have a cult.
It's not a cult yet. Okay. It's called working on it.
True. Exactly. All right. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to next time we talk.
Thanks. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
All right, there we go. Oh fuck. All right.